So in this video, we're going to talk about how to relate graphs to events. In other words, if you're looking at a graph, what kind of event can it be representative of? So graphs are used to show the relationship between two variables. In other words, the x-axis and the y-axis mean two different things, which you kind of already know. There's necessary skills for working with graphs. You've got to be able to interpret a graph, how to sketch a graph, and how to analyze a graph. So let's practice these skills. The first of the three is how to interpret a graph. So let's say a student walks and takes the bus to get to school and home from school each day. Let's describe what the graph shows by labeling each thing. So keeping in mind that we've got our y-axis representing our total distance and our x-axis representing time. The x-axis will almost always represent time if you're talking about time. Okay, so look at this graph for a second. We've got our line slanting upward at a kind of slow, not steep pace, then it pauses, then it goes more steeply, and then it goes less steep. So our first one, remember, our person walks and takes the bus. So when it's slanting diagonally upward, that's where they're walking. Then when it's paused, they're waiting on the bus because this person both walks and takes the bus. Then when it's going at a steeper rate, that's where they're riding the bus because they're moving faster than when they're walking. Then they get off the bus and they walk some more. So that's represented with a line that is less steep. So when you're using a graph to represent something, you really have to pay attention to the slope or the steepness of your lines because that represents whether they are, or the speed at which they're moving. So you have to pay attention to these straight lines because that means a pause or a constant in their movement. But the steepness also determines the speed at which they are moving. So that's how we just interpret a graph when we look at something. Okay, so what about sketching a graph? Look at this problem. A plane is flying from New York to London. We want to sketch a graph of the plane's altitude, altitude just meaning the height, during the flight and label each section. Okay, so again, our time is on the x-axis. This time our altitude is represented by the y-axis. So we're going to take off in New York. We start over here at 0. And obviously, it's not a straight line because it doesn't go up necessarily at a straight line. So we're kind of curving up and then we're going to cruise at an altitude somewhere over here. And even that's not straight, but it's almost straight. And so it kind of stays at a steady pace right up here for a cruising altitude. Then we're going to dip down a little. We all know that as you're waiting to land, you kind of circle around, although that wasn't expressed in the problem. So if this were on a test and you were drawing this and you left out this, I wouldn't count it against you. So you're coming down here, then you've got to come back down and you've got to land back on your x-axis. So the keys to a problem like this where you're sketching a graph, you need to understand that you've got to start at 0 and end at 0 because you know in a plane you both start and end at 0. And at some point you've got to have an altitude up here. At no point is it steady because it kind of goes up and down. We are talking about a plane. Okay. And the last thing that's most important when you're working with graphs is that you've got to be able to analyze it. So here I say a car travels at a steady speed. Which graph could you use to show the speed of a car? Which could show the distance traveled? Okay. The key here is this word steady. Okay. When I say steady, I mean it's at a constant speed. So looking at both of these, which one is steady and which one is changing? So graph 1 shows a steady speed. If you look at graph 1, it's staying at the same rate the entire time. So if we went back and labeled our y-axis on graph 1, we could label this y-axis with the word speed. Okay, our speed here stays exactly the same, kind of like on that other problem where they were waiting for the bus. If we looked here, this one shows change in distance over time. If we labeled this one with the word distance, you can tell that as time increases, so does our distance. So this might show if we started walking, this would say that the longer the time is, the farther we've walked, which is what we're saying. What is the distance traveled? So again, notice the time is represented by the x-axis. So this one is showing movement at a steady rate. This one is showing how far we go and the amount of distance. So these are the three ways that you can interpret graphs. Again, the three important skills are being able to sketch a graph, analyze a graph, and interpret a graph.